welcome. Am I making that sound? Oh. It's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about a subject that I've been interested in for a long time. As most of you know, I grew up in Braintree. My mother's here tonight with my sister. We moved here the week I was born, and I've been here my whole life. And one of the things that what I always enjoyed about Braintree is its history. And I always enjoyed studying history and reading about the notable figures who were born here. We all know that John Adams, of course, was born here, and John Quincy Adams and John Hancock. But tonight I want to talk about probably the most significant individual, not just in local history, but in American history. The contributions he made to United States history, it's just remarkable. And the fact that he grew up right down the street has always pleased me, and I think it makes all of us very proud. Again, John Adams and John Hancock, arguably two of the most influential men of the Revolutionary era, both of them born in Braintree. As we know, John Hancock would soon move to Boston, and he would come to be identified with shipping and commerce in the city of Boston. But John Adams stayed in Braintree. He never left. He became a farmer, a lawyer, married a local girl, Abigail Smith, who lived just a few miles down the street in Weymouth. And Adams will forever be associated with the town of Braintree. And I think it's fitting that one of the most important documents he ever wrote, and a document that played a significant part in the first legal clash between the American colonies and British Parliament, would bear the name of his hometown. That document, of course, is the Braintree Instructions. But before I discuss the instructions, I'd like to first talk about John Adams and his early years and the political culture that he grew up in. Adams was born in October 1735, exactly 280 years ago this past October. Again, not too far from here, just a few miles north at the foot of Penn's Hill, of course, which is now part of Quincy. But several of the streets that we still use, he would have used. Independence Ave, Washington Street, Elm Street, etc. I mean, some of the names have changed, but the layout of several of those streets remain much the same. And the mile marker at the foot of the other side of Penn's Hill, near Ross School, is still there. That would have been there when John Adams walked by or rode by on a weekly basis. He must have traveled up Commercial Street hundreds of times, up Penn's Hill, down the other side, all the way into Weymouth Landing and beyond. John Adams didn't come from money, as John Hancock had. His father was a farmer and a shoemaker, but like many Americans at the time, his father, a farmer, played a very active role in town affairs, serving as a selectman for 9 terms, constable, and as an officer in the militia. Adams would later boast and pridefully say that much of the work of the town of Braintree was run by his father for over a 20-year period. The elder Adams also served as a deacon in his church in the North Precinct for 14 years. John Adams was raised to speak his mind, and by all accounts, he always had something to say. It's interesting to note that had he been born in England, or anywhere else in Europe for that matter, few people would have cared what he had to say. He would have lived in obscurity. In those countries at that time, there was little upward mobility. You lived and died at the same station, a member of the same class into which you were born. I mean, imagine that. John Adams, this incredibly gifted individual, would have languished in anonymity had he been born in Europe. But, fortunately for us, he wasn't born in Europe. He was born in Braintree, Massachusetts. He went to school, worked on the family farm, and despite his father's wish that he become a preacher, he decided on a career in the law. He graduated from Harvard in 1755. The same year, he began to keep a diary he would keep for the rest of his life. We're very fortunate to have virtually his entire adult life in print, and his comments, his views on everything. In his diary, John Adams would often make reference to the town's middle precinct, current-day Braintree, where we are today, an area he often referred to as Monadequat, the name, of course, often used by people at the time to describe the settlement built around the Monadequat River. The center of the settlement was present-day Washington Street and Elm Street. Today we know it as the area that houses the First Congregational Church, All Souls Church, and St. Thomas More Church. That stretch was the hub of activity in the Middle Precinct. After graduating from Harvard, he went to Worcester and for a time was a school teacher, but that was only temporary. The profession he was determined to pursue was the law. And he began practicing under the direction of Samuel Putnam, one of the most respected attorneys in the state, not just in Worcester. He stayed in Worcester for about 2 years, leaving there in 1757, and he returned to Braintree and was admitted to the bar the next year, in 1758. Within a year of his return to Braintree, he was first introduced to a young lady who would change his life. Her name was Abigail Smith, and they first met in the living room of Reverend William Smith's living room in Weymouth, again, not too far from here, in the summer of 1759. While Adams was meeting with Reverend Smith, he was introduced to Abigail and her 2 sisters. By all accounts, John and Abigail weren't very impressed with one another at that first meeting. But it's not surprising. There was quite a bit of an age gap. John Adams was 24 at the time, and Abigail wasn't yet 15. So there's almost 10 years difference between the two. And actually, John Adams was dating someone at the time. But that didn't last too long. Her name was Hannah Quincy. But again, that courtship lasted just a few more months. Over the next few years, John and Abigail would meet several times. John, by now an established attorney, often had legal business in Weymouth, and that included business with the Reverend Smith. By 1761, 2 years after they first met, they were exchanging letters on a regular basis. And Adams saw in Abigail, and he often commented on it, something that he didn't see in any other woman. Even though she wasn't formally educated, she was a match for John Adams in every way. She had been taught at home and encouraged to read, and she was also encouraged to speak her mind. Not that common at the time. And she didn't hesitate to express her opinion or disagree with John Adams on a regular basis. We see it in their writings. And she would always push back and challenge him, and that's exactly what he really needed. They were married on October 25th, 1764, in the same room where they first met, just a few days before his 29th birthday, and 5 years after they met. So she was about 19 when they were married. And that began one of the most incredible and influential partnerships in American history, one that would last for 54 years. While most people, I think, recognize the intelligence of Abigail Adams, I don't think most people appreciate the degree to which she influenced her husband. She was without a doubt his most trusted advisor and political confidant. She had incredible political instincts, and the letters she wrote to John when he was away are full of shrewd and pointed recommendations that he invariably followed. Once they were married, John and Abigail settled in Braintree in the home that he inherited from his father, again at the foot of Penn's Hill. His dad had recently passed away. He owned 60 acres of land and a small house, but he had a steady income as an attorney and a promising future. As much as he enjoyed the law, though, it wasn't enough. Even before he married Abigail, John was interested in local Braintree politics. And for an extremely ambitious young man, and he was, who would accomplish great things, the issues being debated in Braintree weren't terribly exciting and offered little chance to make a name for himself. Nonetheless, matters of government did interest him, and he did jump into them with both feet. It might be hard for us to imagine now the future president dealing with such issues as road construction and road repairs, but those were the two major topics of discussion at the time in every town in colonial America. And John Adams very actively engaged in these issues with a sense of purpose. He later referred to these early years in his memoirs, and he remembered that there had been a long-standing controversy in Braintree over the best way to conduct road repairs, the best way to pay for road repairs, things that we still talk about today. A good friend of his, Judge Samuel Niles, an older, very respected man in Braintree who really served as a mentor of sorts to John Adams, had been trying for years to get the town of Braintree to vote for tax to be imposed on all Braintree landowners to help fund road repairs on a regular basis. Adams noted that, quote, the roads were very bad and much neglected. And I thought a tax a more equitable method and more likely to be effectual, and therefore I joined this party with Judge Niles in a public speech. The vote was carried, Adams said, by a large majority, and I was appointed to prepare a bylaw to be enacted at the next meeting. Upon inquiry, I found that Roxbury, and after them Weymouth, had already adopted this course. I procured a copy of their laws and prepared a plan for Braintree, so he didn't have to reinvent the wheel. And he reported it to the town, and it was accepted by a great majority. He said, under this law, the roads have been repaired to this very day, and the effects of it are visible to every eye. Adams hasn't been back to Braintree in a while, apparently, but they were repaired. This was John Adams' first success at Braintree Town Meeting, and he was very proud of it, and he made reference to it in his diary. He discovered that he did have a gift for influencing people and getting things done. Where even the well-respected Judge Niles, who everybody liked, where he had failed before, John Adams was able to move the issue forward and not only get the necessary votes, but have it passed by a huge majority. Another issue that really concerned this young attorney was the proliferation of taverns in the town. Adams didn't approve of taverns, at least not a lot of them. And that was a problem because Braintree had more taverns than any other town in the region. Let me read you a brief passage from his diary. Few things, I believe, have deviated so far from the first design of their institution, are so fruitful of destructive evils, or so needful of a speedy regulation as licensed houses. The Board of Selectmen would license these houses. The accommodation of strangers, and perhaps of town inhabitants on public occasions, are the only warrantable intentions of a tavern, and the supply of the neighborhood with necessary liquors in small quantities and at the cheapest rates are the only excusable designs of a retailer. And that these purposes may be effected, it is necessary that both should be selected from the most virtuous and wealthy people who will accept the trust. And so few shall be erected that the profits may enable them to make the best provision at a moderate price. But at the present day, such houses have become the eternal haunt of loose, disorderly people, which renders them offensive and unfit for entertainment of a traveler of the least delicacy. He was making his point. Adams wanted the town to reduce the number of taverns and make sure that they were run by people of good character. This introduces the next subject. John Adams was never a big fan of Captain Ebenezer Thayer, Jr. Captain Ebenezer Thayer, Jr. Thayer was perhaps the most powerful politician in Braintree in the Middle Precinct at the time. He was a Braintree selectman and the town's representative to the General Court, our equivalent of our state representative. For almost 2 decades, he was our state representative or representative to the General Court. He was captain of militia. Very popular, very powerful. John Adams disliked him, I think, on 2 accounts. One, he kept taverns. He was very wealthy, these taverns, in the Middle Precinct. And 2, and I think this bothered Adams even more, he dabbled, as Adams called it, in the practice of law. He wasn't a lawyer, but he dabbled in the practice of law in the taverns, obviously over the bar. And it drove Adams crazy. He made reference to it all the time. But the fact that there was the only representative to the General Court for a long period of time was likely another reason Adams didn't care for the man. Why? Because Adams, interested in politics himself, believed he could be a worthy representative for the town. But Thayer was unwilling to loosen his grip on the job. And for the up-and-coming Adams, Thayer was a natural adversary. My favorite Adams passage on the subject of taverns was written in May 30th, and that's an important date, May 30th, 1760. He wrote, quote, "Here," meaning the taverns, "the time, the money, the health, and the modesty of most that are young and many who are old are wasted. Here diseases, vicious habits, bastards, and legislators are frequently begotten." He was really uptight that night when he wrote these words. I mention the date May 30th because earlier that day, Ebenezer Thayer had just been appointed to another term as the town's representative to the General Court. Adams, it seems, was beginning to equate bastards with legislators. Adams' objections to the taverns led him to write his very first series of essays called The Evils of Licensed Houses, though they were never published. In them, he did repeat a lot of the criticisms, not just of the establishments themselves, but of the people who ran them. And I think this really tells us something about Adams. At one point in 1761, he actually drew a map of Braintree. Some of you may have seen it. Map of Braintree and Weymouth, pinpointing each and every tavern in the area. He was particularly frustrated that there were many more taverns in Braintree than there were in Milton, Dorchester, Roxbury, and all of the other surrounding communities. It's interesting to note, however, that at the very center of the map was Captain Ebenezer Thayer's house. He used that as the center. And you could see how many taverns were owned by Thayer within a mile-and-a-half radius. In one diary entry, after observing that many of the tavern owners had become town officials, Ebenezer Thayer being one of them, Adams concluded, quote, "Taverns and dram shops are therefore placed in every corner of the town, where poor mankind, allured by the smell of brandy and rum, resort and carouse, waste their time, spend their money, run in debt to the tavern owner and others, grow attached to the taverner, who is attached to his patron both by gratitude and expectation." Adams did not like that relationship that was being established between the tavern owner and his patrons. By reading Adams' diary entries, you really get a clear picture of Braintree politics at the time. He mentions names all the time. There were clearly two camps in the town. On the one side was Captain Ebenezer Thayer, Atherton Thayer, Thomas Hollis, as well as Ebenezer Miller and Thomas Faxon. They were clearly in one camp. They were around the same age, and they tended to vote and agree with one another on most of the issues at the time. Adams referred to this group as the meddlers, hinters, and projectors. Perhaps not surprisingly, several of these men were also known to dabble in the law, which Adams didn't appreciate because it also cut into his territory. He was trying to make a living as a lawyer, a professional lawyer. And he would often refer to these non-professional lawyers as, quote, pettifogging dabblers. Pettifogging dabblers. He would use that term quite often to describe his adversaries in Braintree. And Adams could be harsh, and he could be cruel in his writings. In one diary entry, he described how he berated Thomas Hollis, a member of that other camp, who apparently ran into tough financial times with creditors. Hollis went to Adams for legal advice. Adams was good. He was a professional, so Hollis went to him. And Adams did help him, but only after giving him a lecture. Adams wrote in his diary that the reason Hollis was in such bad financial shape was because he was dabbling in the law, of which he knows nothing, Adams said. And Adams then said he should have stuck to shoemaking. And he probably said that to Hollis, his client. So he could be harsh. Many times he could be harsh. Fortunately for America, lecturing people on the immorality of public houses and finding ways to finance road construction never really satisfied John Adams. He was very interested in the larger political issues of the day. He was an early supporter of the Whigs and quickly identified himself and was identified as an eloquent supporter of the Patriot cause. He drew people's attention because he was a good writer, and he was an excellent attorney, a brilliant legal mind, and it was obvious from the beginning. Just as other attorneys did at the time, Adams often traveled the court circuit, which would take him several weeks. This gave him a chance not only to hone his legal skills and build a strong reputation, but it exposed him to some of the best minds in Massachusetts, and there were several. His travels often took him as far north as Maine, bless you, which was then part of Massachusetts. He would regularly meet and socialize with other professional attorneys as well as judges, and they would often stay in the same inns and taverns. Again, these attorneys and judges were not pettifoggers. They were the real deal. Again, they'd often stay in the same taverns, and they usually spent their nights in front of the fire debating the political issues of the day, which in the 1760s usually revolved around the deteriorating relationship between the American colonies and British Parliament. Since the end of the French and Indian War, Parliament was changing imperial policy. They were looking to change the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. Many Americans, like John Adams, would be very much opposed to these changes. Respected men throughout the colony were beginning to make note of the fact that this young attorney from Braintree was extremely eloquent and a wonderful advocate of American rights. Despite his contempt for many of the town leaders, Adams continued to remain active in Braintree government. Because of his legal background, he served on many committees established by town meeting. His name appears many times in the town reports, serving, among other things, on the committee to lay out highways. And he was doing this in the 1760s, selling town-owned land, dealing with leases, again, using his legal background to help the town of Braintree. He enjoyed town meeting. And other boring but necessary functions that you need to make a town run. Then everything changed. 1765. John Adams was given a gift in the form of legislation called the Stamp Act. He didn't consider it a gift at the time, but I think we can look back and consider it a gift. It was issued by Parliament. This would be the vehicle Adams would use to make a name for himself, not just outside Braintree or even Massachusetts, but across the sea. Within a few months, the name John Adams would be known in the halls of power in London. The Stamp Act was pushed for by Lord George Grenville, who was Prime Minister, as a means to help pay down the huge debt incurred by Great Britain as a result of the French and Indian War. Grenville reasoned that the Americans should share in the cost of the war. Parliament endorsed the measure in March 1765, and the act, which sought to tax all Americans for most printed materials, including not only legal documents like mortgages, deeds, and wills, and contracts and other things, but also diplomas, pamphlets, posters, newspapers, and even playing cards, would require paper stamps or pressed seals, which would evidence that you paid the necessary tax. While Britain had long taxed Americans through trade policies, the Stamp Act represented the first direct internal tax placed on the American people, and they were not pleased. Cities and towns throughout the American colonies debated how best to respond to this threat, and they saw it as a dangerous threat. In August, violence erupted in Boston. Organized mobs attacked the home of Andrew Oliver, the man who was supposed to serve as the tax distributor in Massachusetts. The mob hung his effigy from the Liberty Tree and then cut off its head. They then attacked his house. The next day, he resigned his post as tax distributor. The mob then turned their attention on the Lieutenant Governor, Thomas Hutchinson, who also served as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Judicature. He was the head of the SJC, our SJC, the chief judge in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He was not an attorney. He was not a professional attorney. He was given this job as a reward from the Crown. Hutchinson and his family barely escaped as the mob broke into his house. They spent the entire night destroying the house piece by piece. It's been said that the phrase, "they took everything but the kitchen sink," refers to the attack on Thomas Hutchinson's house in Boston that night. He appeared in court the next day, visibly shaken. And that clearly represented a change in course in the American colonies. But there were also acts of nonviolent opposition. In Braintree, Massachusetts, John Adams, as he would many times later, took the initiative. He petitioned the selectmen to call a special town meeting in August 1765 to instruct their representative to the General Court, Thayer, on how to respond to the Stamp Act. As we all know, Captain Ebenezer Thayer, the pettifogging, tavern-owning meddler, was our representative. So Adams did take it upon himself to begin drafting the instructions. He wanted to make sure that he had a say in what was done. And he went before town meeting. Town meeting was convened, and a committee was created to draft the instructions, which of course wasn't necessary because Adams had already done it. 4 of the 5 committee members included Adams's friend and mentor, Judge Samuel Niles, again, the well-respected 54-year-old lawyer, deacon, former selectman, former representative to the General Court, and the moderator for the previous 10 years. So this was a very well-respected gentleman. He was on the committee. Also on the committee were Selectman Norton Quincy, who was 49 at the time, Deacon James Penniman, who was 57, and Captain John Hayward, who who was 52. So this group of middle-aged men, all of whom had been active in town affairs for well over 30 years, were joined by the fifth member of the committee, 29-year-old attorney John Adams. According to Adams, the group retired to Judge Niles's house, where they briefly discussed and then unanimously adopted Adams's draft instructions without amendment, according to Adams. The instructions were then presented to town meeting, and then town meeting, according to Adams, approved them without amendment. So it was Adams, and Adams alone, who authored what came to be called the Braintree Instructions. The instructions themselves argued that the Stamp Act was an illegal violation of long-standing American rights. Adams, made three basic arguments. First, the Stamp Act was unconstitutional because Parliament was claiming a power to tax colonists that it didn't possess. Second, by taking this unprecedented step, the members of Parliament were the true radicals, and the colonists were the true conservatives. They were trying to maintain the existing order. And third, given the illegality of the Stamp Act, the only proper way to proceed was to refuse to obey it. While his arguments weren't necessarily original, they were direct and succinct. He observed, quote, "We have always understood it to be a grand and fundamental principle of the English Constitution that no free man should be subject to any tax to which he has not given his own consent." The people of Massachusetts, of course, were not represented in Parliament, he argued, adding that the measure even violated Magna Carta itself. He added that, quote, "We can no longer forbear complaining that many of the measures of Parliament have a tendency to divest us of some of the most essential rights and liberties, and that we have reason to think the execution of that act, or even for even a short space of time, would drain the country of cash, strip multitudes of the poorer people of all their property, and reduce them to absolute beggary. And what the consequence would be of so sudden a shock and such a convulsive change in the whole course of our business and subsistence to the peace of the province, we tremble to consider." He concluded, "We further recommend the most clear and explicit assertion and vindication of our rights and liberties to be entered on the public records, that the world may know in the present and all future generations that we have a clear knowledge and a just sense of those rights and liberties, and with that submission to divine providence, we can never be slaves." It was powerful. Richard Draper, who published the Massachusetts Gazette at the time, asked Adams to provide him a copy of the Braintree Instructions, and they appeared in the October 10th edition of the Massachusetts Gazette. 4 days later, they were printed in the Boston Gazette. The other one was a Massachusetts Gazette. Adams would later humbly observe that the Braintree Instructions made a profound impression upon the freemen of the province, and that over 40 other towns adopted them to guide their representatives during the session of the General Court. This lawyer and farmer from Braintree, acting as a member of Braintree town meeting, articulated America's objection to the Stamp Act as no one else had, and it played an important role in the growing chorus against the proposed act, and it contributed to the Stamp Act Congress, the very first gathering of American colonies. 9 colonies would attend the conference in New York City. The Braintree Instructions certainly wasn't the only reason the Stamp Act was ultimately abandoned by Parliament several months later, but it did represent one of the earliest legal challenges to British authority. And that's an important distinction. We all remember the violence leading up to the Revolution and the forced resignation of the stamp distributors, but we seldom remember the legal challenges to British authority, and John Adams was committed to the rule of law. Just as his cousin, Samuel Adams, helped orchestrate the violent response to the Stamp Act in Boston, John Adams argued quite persuasively that the law was on their side. I would note, however, that with respect to the issue of violence, that a valuable lesson had been learned during the Stamp Act crisis. Many in Boston, and throughout the colonies for that matter, believed that Great Britain had backed down because of the violence. If it could work once, perhaps it would work again in the future, they thought. And of course, that is what would happen. That would help encourage them in later years. In March 1766, and then again in 67, Adams was appointed by town meeting to the Board of Selectmen for the first time at the age of 30, and he worked with Captain Thayer. In 1967, he was joined by his friend Jonas Bass, who, by the way, he said, owned a reputable public house in the North Precinct. And that's where Adams would frequently travel and spend his time and debate the issues of the day. Adams often said it was a proper stagehouse for gentlemen who were traveling from Boston to Plymouth and Cape Cod. Bass, of course, was a strong ally of Adams and had been for a long time. Another young man, they connected at town meeting and worked together on a number of different issues. In 1768, Adams noted in his diary that his friends in Boston were encouraging him to move there. Although he was reappointed to serve as a selectman in Braintree, he wrote a letter to the board declining the appointment because it was, quote, incompatible with his other engagements. That's how it appears in the Braintree town report. So it would seem that by 1768, John Adams had perhaps outgrown Braintree government, or at least desired to interact with other Whig leaders. And he was less interested in focusing on local issues like road repairs and taverns. He and his family, which now included John Quincy Adams, moved to Boston for a while. It's interesting to note that the only time John Adams ever was sent to the General Court as a representative was from Boston, never from Braintree. Ebenezer Thayer continued to serve as a representative from the town of Braintree. Adams clearly enjoyed life in Boston, and in his autobiography, he related an interesting encounter. He was invited to dinner one night in 1768 by his friend, Jonathan Sewell, who, after dinner, relayed a message from Governor Bernard. It seems the office of Advocate General in the Court of Admiralty was vacant, and the governor, a Crown appointee, wanted Adams to take it, offering him a big job. It was an excellent job, paid very good money, and provided a chance to move up the ladder for royal favor and promotion. Adams asked, "Why me?" Sewell replied that the governor said he wanted Adams because of his talents, integrity, reputation, and success in court, and that he was the best man for the job. To his credit, Adams didn't have to wait to give an answer. He said as much as he appreciated the offer, he had to decline. Quote, "On account of the unsettled state of the country and scruples about laying myself under any restraints or obligations of gratitude to the government for any of their favors." So Adams did not take the job. So it's interesting, while the governor didn't care that Adams disagreed with the government on a number of different issues, Adams was convinced that the British government, including the king, his ministers, and Parliament, were, as he said, persevering in a system wholly inconsistent with all my ideas of right, justice, and policy. Instead, Adams continued to devote his time to the law practice, to the practice of law. He was living in Boston at the time that Britain began to increase the number of troops coming to the colonies, and a disproportionate number of those British troops were sent to Boston, where Adams was living. In fact, Adams was only a few streets away from the shooting when the Boston Massacre took place in December 1770. After hearing what happened, he concluded, quote, "If these poor tools," meaning the British soldiers who opened fire on the crowd, "should be prosecuted for any of their illegal conduct, they must be punished. If, however, the soldiers in self-defense should kill any of them, they must be tried, and if truth was respected and the law prevailed, must be acquitted." In a surprising move, Adams agreed to defend the soldiers and Captain Preston, who led them, arguing that, quote, "the bar must be impartial at all times and in every circumstance." Even though the popular sentiment, of course, was against the soldiers, John Adams not only agreed to represent them, but managed to get them acquitted. He did a brilliant job in that trial. And Adams would later observe and note that he was particularly proud of the impartiality he showed during that trial. More importantly, however, his defense of the soldiers was proof again that Britain wasn't simply dealing with a mob, but with a dedicated, thoughtful people who were committed to the rule of law. And as many people were beginning to recognize, nobody stood for the rule of law more than John Adams. In fact, far from hurting Adams in the eyes of his fellow countrymen, his participation in the Boston Massacre trials only elevated his reputation. He quickly became a respected figure throughout the colonies. Soon, Adams would be appointed as a member to the First and Second Continental Congresses. Arriving in Philadelphia in 1774, he was quickly recognized as one of its hardest-working members. They all identified him as passionate and intelligent. His name appears in the correspondence of many members of that Congress. He was incredibly active. With his training as a lawyer, he handled himself well and could hold his own with anyone in debate. He also worked extremely hard and, again, was an excellent writer. He served on the most important committees of the First and Second Continental Congress and played a large part in preparing addresses to the king and other heads of state of Europe. Long way from dealing with Captain Ebenezer Thayer. We all know that after the war began with the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, it was John Adams who got up and spoke at Congress in Philadelphia, insisting on the urgent need to save the New England Army. And it was he who insisted that George Washington of Virginia head the Army. The motion was seconded by Samuel Adams, his cousin. This was an important decision and one he thought about carefully. Adams knew that New England couldn't possibly do it alone. There needed to be unity, and what better way to tie the North with the South than to appoint a Virginian to head the Army. The president of the Congress, incidentally, was John Hancock, again, another son of Braintree. Later, in 1776, it was John Adams who, in May, first offered a resolution that the colonists should form governments independent of the Crown. He was the first. He was among the first. This, of course, was the biggest step of all. And just as Braintree Town Meeting formed a committee 11 years earlier to draft a response to the Stamp Act, the Continental Congress voted to appoint a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence, 11 years after the Braintree Instructions. And, just as Braintree had done, the Congress turned to John Adams, as well as Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, to draft the document. Reflecting, I think, the respect that the others had for these two gentlemen, the other members of the committee asked John Adams and Thomas Jefferson to actually prepare the draft. And John Adams, recognizing that Jefferson was the better writer, deferred to him. Therefore, Jefferson would be the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, though John Adams did assist with the writing and would prove to be its staunchest defender at Congress. Jefferson would later write of the floor debate, quote, John Adams was our colossus on the floor. Not graceful, not elegant, not always fluent in his public addresses, yet he came out with a power, both of thought and of expression, that moved us all from our seats. He later said, John Adams was the pillar of its support on the floor of the Congress, its ablest advocate and defender against the multifarious assaults which were made against it. And then, of course, on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was adopted unanimously. Writing to his wife, Abigail, a day later, Adams said, quote, yesterday the greatest question was decided that was ever debated in America, and greater perhaps never was or will be decided among men. He went on to describe how momentous the event was and how it would be celebrated for generations to come with pomp, bells, guns, bonfires, and illuminations. He said, you will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil, the blood, and treasure that it will cost to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of light and glory. Again, very perceptive, very eloquent. Here was a person who clearly understood what was happening. Again, perhaps the most momentous event in the history of modern man. And there in the middle of it was this middle-aged, overweight attorney from Braintree, Massachusetts, influencing events like nobody else was. I won't go into all of the things that John Adams did during the war. He served on multiple committees, traveled far and wide to raise money for the cause, to obtain recognition for the new government. But after independence was declared, the 13 American states were obliged to draft new constitutions, and many would use as a guide a pamphlet that was written by John Adams. His Thoughts on Government stands as one of the least discussed, yet I think one of the most incredibly influential documents in modern political history. most of the state constitutions were used, or they referred to John Adams' pamphlet. In 1779, Adams returned to Braintree from France, where he was serving as commissioner, just as his state, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, was calling together a convention to draft a state constitution. Fittingly, he was elected to represent Braintree at the Constitutional Convention. And again, it was he who drafted the report of the Constitution for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which was adopted after a few amendments in 1780. He wrote that Constitution in his living room in Braintree. This document is often referred to as the oldest Constitution in the world, and much of it was used as the basis for the federal Constitution that was adopted later that decade. He did most of the work, as I said, at the desk in his home. And several years later, when the federal Constitution was drafted, right in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, John Adams wasn't physically there at the time. He was the nation's first ambassador to the Court of St. James in Great Britain. Nonetheless, his presence was felt. He was referred to many times during the discussions. We have a transcript of all of those hearings at the Constitutional Convention. He would, of course, go on to serve as the first Vice President of the United States and second President of the United States. But in conclusion, let me just say this about John Adams. At a time in world history, again, particularly Western history, when political leaders were drawn from the noble class, in a small corner of America, just south of Boston, the son of a farmer and shoemaker was raised in an environment of political freedom. Distance had provided Americans with the opportunity to develop their own unique culture, which drew upon the new ideas of Western thought. While British and French philosophers talked about freedom, liberty, and equality, Americans were actually living it. And when given the chance to articulate those principles, nobody did a better job than John Adams. Thank you.